The autumn leaves were falling on Liberty High School's parking lot when Marcus Johnson's life changed forever. At 17, he was the kind of student every teacher bragged about. Smart, respectful, and talented enough to have college basketball scouts showing up at his games. His mother had raised him alone since he was 5, working double shifts as a nurse to make sure he had everything he needed to succeed. That Thursday afternoon was like any other. Marcus was running drills with his team in the gym, his sneakers squeaking against the polished floor as Coach Thompson pushed them through their usual 2-hour practice. He had no idea that 3 miles away, at Pete's corner store, a robbery was taking place. A young man in a blue hoodie had threatened the cashier with a knife, grabbing $220 from the register before running away. The police cars showed up at Liberty High just as practice was ending. Marcus was still wiping sweat from his face with a towel when 2 officers walked into the gym. They weren't there to chat. They had handcuffs ready. Marcus Johnson, one officer called out, his voice echoing in the now silent gymnasium. "You're under arrest for armed robbery." Coach Thompson immediately stepped forward. "There must be some mistake," he said, his voice firm. "Marcus has been here with me for the past 2 hours. We have 20 witnesses right here, and the security cameras can prove it." But the officers weren't listening. They had a witness who claimed they saw Marcus running from the store, and that was enough for them. Word spread fast in their small town of Milton Creek. By dinner time, everyone knew that Robert Johnson's boy had been arrested. The same people who used to smile at Marcus in church now crossed the street when they saw his mother coming. It didn't matter that the security footage from the store showed a robber who was shorter than Marcus, or that the basketball team's practice video clearly showed him making free throws at the exact time of the robbery. When Marcus's case landed on Judge William Harrison's desk, those who knew the judge's reputation felt their hearts sink. Harrison had served on the bench for 20 years, and his pattern was clear as day. If you were young and black in his courtroom, you were probably headed to jail. The public defender assigned to Marcus's case, fresh out of law school and overwhelmed with 50 other cases, barely had time to put together a proper defense. The day of the hearing, Marcus sat straight in his chair, wearing the suit his mother had bought him for church. The evidence of his innocence was strong. Coach Thompson's testimony, the security footage, even the store owner admitting he wasn't completely sure about the identification. But Judge Harrison hardly looked at any of it. He stared down at Marcus from his high bench, his cold blue eyes already decided. Marcus's mother squeezed his hand under the table as they waited for the verdict. She had faith that the truth would win out, that no one could look at her boy, at his clean record and bright future, and see a criminal. But she didn't know Judge Harrison like others did. She didn't know about the dozens of young black men he'd sent to prison on flimsy evidence, or how he bragged at his country club about being tough on crime. The gavel came down like thunder in the quiet courtroom. 5 years in state prison. Marcus felt the room spin as his mother's sobs filled the air. Coach Thompson stood up, shouting about the evidence they hadn't even looked at, but the bailiff was already moving forward with handcuffs. The last thing Marcus saw before being led away was Judge Harrison's face, not angry, not pleased, just blank, as if he'd just signed off on a parking ticket instead of destroying a young man's life. The courtroom on sentencing day felt like a pressure cooker about to explode. People packed the wooden benches, Marcus's teammates wearing their Liberty High basketball jerseys, church members clutching their prayer beads, and reporters from the local paper scribbling in their notepads. The morning sun filtered through tall windows, casting prison bar shadows across the floor. Marcus's mother, Linda Johnson, had spent her last savings hiring a proper lawyer for the sentencing hearing. Attorney James Chen came highly recommended, known for taking on cases others considered lost causes. He'd spent weeks gathering evidence, school records showing Marcus's 3.8 GPA, letters from teachers praising his character, and documentation of the basketball scholarship offers that were now slipping away. Judge Harrison entered the courtroom, his black robe flowing behind him like a dark cloud. The room rose, but his eyes never left his papers. Attorney Chen approached the podium first, his voice steady and clear. "Your Honor, we have overwhelming evidence of Marcus Johnson's character and innocence. 19 witnesses place him at basketball practice during the robbery. The security footage shows." "Counselor," Judge Harrison interrupted, his voice dripping with disdain. "We've been through the evidence. This hearing is for sentencing, not reopening the case." His words felt like ice water down everyone's backs. One by one, character witnesses approached the stand. Coach Thompson's voice shook with anger as he described Marcus's leadership on the team. "This boy's been in my gym every afternoon for 4 years. He mentors younger players. He stays late to help clean up. This is not a criminal, Your Honor. This is one of the finest young men I've ever coached." Marcus's English teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, spoke next. "Marcus wrote an essay last month about his dreams of becoming a lawyer," she said, pulling out a paper from her bag. "He wanted to help people who couldn't afford legal representation. The irony of this situation would be amusing if it weren't so tragic." When Linda Johnson took the stand, the room fell silent. She'd worked a double shift at the hospital the night before, but her nurse's uniform was crisp and clean. "My son," she began, then had to stop as tears welled up. "My son has never been in trouble a day in his life. I raised him alone after his father passed, and he's been my strength. He helps elderly neighbors with their groceries. He tutors kids at the community center. The boy you're describing in these charges, that's not my Marcus." Judge Harrison barely looked up during any of the testimonies. He checked his watch twice, shuffled papers, and whispered to his clerk. When it was Marcus's turn to speak, he stood tall despite the weight of the chains around his wrists. "Your Honor," Marcus said, his voice clear and strong, "I know I'm innocent. But more than that, I know who I am. I'm not asking for mercy. I'm asking for justice. Look at the evidence. Look at the truth. That's all I want." The judge finally looked directly at Marcus, and something flickered in his eyes. Not compassion, but something harder, colder. He cleared his throat and delivered the sentence as if reading a grocery list. 5 years in state prison, with possibility of parole after 3 years. The courtroom erupted. Linda Johnson collapsed, crying out, "My baby. Not my baby." Coach Thompson kicked a chair, shouting about injustice. Mrs. Rodriguez began reciting statistics about racial bias in sentencing. But Judge Harrison was already standing, gathering his papers, immune to the chaos he'd just unleashed. As officers led Marcus away, he caught a glimpse through the window of his team's basketball bus in the parking lot. They'd been heading to the state championships next week. He'd been their captain, their point guard. Now he was just another statistic in Judge Harrison's ledger of broken dreams. State prison wasn't anything like the movies Marcus had watched. It was worse. The constant noise never stopped. Metal doors clanging, inmates shouting, guards barking orders. His first night, lying on a thin mattress in his cell, Marcus counted the cinder blocks on the wall until sunrise, trying to convince himself this wasn't real. His cellmate, an older man named Ray who was serving 15 years for drug possession, took Marcus under his wing. "First thing you gotta do," Ray told him, "is keep your mind sharp. Prison wants to make you forget who you are. Don't let it." Ray had earned his GED behind bars and was working on a college degree through a correspondence program. Marcus took Ray's advice to heart. He signed up for every educational program available. During the day, he attended classes in the prison's education wing, studying everything from literature to mathematics. At night, he read books from the prison library until lights out. His mother sent him college textbooks whenever she could afford them, each one a reminder of the future he was determined to reclaim. But it wasn't all about studying. Marcus noticed the younger inmates, especially the teenagers who came in scared and angry like he had been. He started a mentoring program, meeting with them during yard time. "Your story isn't over," he'd tell them. "This is just a chapter." The guards were skeptical at first, But they couldn't deny that the young inmates in Marcus's program caused fewer problems. Linda visited every Sunday without fail, even when she had to work double shifts to afford the bus fare. She always brought news from home: how his basketball team had dedicated their season to him, how the community was starting to question Judge Harrison's decisions, how a group called the Innocence Project had shown interest in his case. The Innocence Project lawyers visited 6 months into his sentence. They explained how they used DNA evidence and old case files to free wrongly convicted people. "Your case has red flags all over it," Sarah Martinez, one of their attorneys, told him. The witness identification was shaky, the evidence wasn't properly reviewed, and Judge Harrison's sentencing pattern shows clear racial bias. Marcus learned to measure time differently inside, not by days or weeks, but by small victories. The day he helped another inmate learn to read. The morning he got an A on his college algebra test. The afternoon when Sarah Martinez came back with news that they'd found inconsistencies in the original police report. But prison had its dark days too. Marcus missed his high school graduation. His acceptance letters to colleges arrived at his empty home. His mother sent him pictures of his basketball team at the state championships, where they placed second. "Could have won it with you," Coach Thompson wrote in a letter. The hardest part wasn't the confinement or the loss of freedom. It was watching his mother age through weekly visits. Linda's hair was graying faster, the lines around her eyes deeper. She tried to hide how tired she was, but Marcus could see the toll his imprisonment was taking on her. Still, she never missed a visit, never stopped fighting for him. One day, during yard time, a new inmate recognized Marcus from the news. "You're that kid the racist judge locked up," he said. "Man, you won't believe this. His daughter just started working at the hospital where your mama works. The whole town's talking about it." Marcus just nodded, but something stirred inside him. Maybe this was the change in the story he'd been waiting for. Sarah Harrison never wanted to follow in her father's footsteps. While Judge William Harrison shaped lives with his gavel, she chose to save them with her stethoscope. Fresh out of medical school, she started her residency at Milton Creek General Hospital, the same hospital where Linda Johnson worked night shifts as a nurse. The other residents whispered about her last name. "That's Judge Harrison's daughter," they'd say when she walked past. Sarah pretended not to hear, throwing herself into her work with fierce determination. She chose the emergency room, the most challenging department, where split-second decisions could mean life or death. Her father hadn't approved of her career choice. "Doctors work for people who should be helping themselves," he'd said over dinner years ago. "The law is about maintaining order." Sarah remembered how her mother had quietly pushed her peas around her plate, saying nothing. That was their family's way. Judge Harrison spoke. Everyone else listened. In the ER, Sarah saw a different world from her privileged upbringing. She treated gunshot victims from neighborhoods her father called troubled areas. She bandaged children whose families couldn't afford regular checkups. She held the hands of elderly patients who had to choose between buying medicine or paying rent. Linda Johnson's reputation preceded her in the hospital. Other nurses spoke of her in hushed, respectful tones. "Best nurse on the night shift," they'd say. Never missed a day, even after what happened to her son. Sarah had heard fragments of the story, something about a wrongful conviction, but she avoided asking questions, afraid of what she might learn about her father's role. One quiet night shift changed everything. Sarah was reviewing patient charts when she overheard two nurses talking. "Linda's boy wrote again," one said. "Still studying in prison, if you can believe it. Honor roll student, basketball captain, and that judge just threw him away like trash." Sarah's hands froze over her paperwork, her heart pounding. Unable to help herself, Sarah began investigating. She pulled up old newspaper articles on her phone during breaks. Each new detail hit her like a physical blow. The ignored evidence, the rushed trial, the harsh sentence, and at the center of it all, her father's name, appearing again and again like an accusation. She started watching Linda more closely. Despite everything, The older nurse moved through the ER with grace and compassion. She never complained, never spoke ill of Judge Harrison, even when other staff members made comments. But Sarah noticed how Linda's shoulders seemed to carry an invisible weight, how her smile never quite reached her eyes. During a particularly busy shift, Sarah and Linda worked together to save a teenage boy who'd been in a car accident. As they stabilized him, Sarah saw Linda's hands shake slightly. "He's about Marcus's age," Linda whispered, almost to herself. "My boy would've been a doctor by now, or a lawyer maybe." She quickly wiped her eyes and returned to work, professional as ever. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She lay awake in her apartment, surrounded by medical textbooks and half-empty coffee cups, thinking about Marcus Johnson, about her father, about justice, about the comfortable lie she'd been living, pretending her father's decisions didn't destroy lives. As dawn broke over Milton Creek, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She wouldn't be silent anymore. Not when silence meant complicity. The emergency room buzzed with its usual chaos when the ambulance sirens pierced the night air. Sarah Harrison was just finishing her 12th straight hour when the paramedics burst through the doors. Female, mid-50s, severe chest pain, possible heart attack. They rattled off. BP dropping. Patient lost consciousness during transport. As they wheeled the gurney in, Sarah's heart stopped for a moment. On the stretcher lay Linda Johnson, her blue nurse's uniform still on, her face gray and twisted in pain. She'd collapsed while working her shift in the pediatric ward upstairs. "Get her to Bay 3, Sarah ordered, pushing aside her shock. Her training kicked in as she barked orders to the team. Linda's heart monitor beeped erratically, each unsteady beat a reminder of how quickly life could change. Sarah's hands moved with practiced precision as she worked to save the woman her father had wronged. As they stabilized Linda, Sarah found herself talking to her unconscious patient. "Stay with us, Linda. Marcus needs you. We all need you." The name slipped out before she could stop herself, causing a nearby nurse to look at her sharply. Hours passed in a blur of medical procedures and tense moments. When Linda finally stabilized, Sarah sat heavily in a chair beside her bed, watching the steady rise and fall of her chest. The woman's purse had spilled during the commotion, and a letter peeked out, the prison watermark visible on the envelope. With trembling hands, Sarah picked up the letter. She knew she shouldn't read it, but something compelled her. Marcus's words jumped off the page. "Mom, the Innocence Project found new evidence. They say Judge Harrison ignored similar cases where the real perpetrators were caught. Stay strong. I love you." Linda stirred, her eyes fluttering open. "Dr. Harrison," she whispered, recognition dawning on her face. There was no hatred in her voice, only a deep, tired sadness that made Sarah's guilt even worse. "Mrs. Johnson, you had a heart attack," Sarah explained, her voice professional despite her churning emotions. "The stress, the long hours, she hesitated, then continued, everything you've been through. It's taken a toll on your heart." Linda's eyes filled with tears. "I can't get sick now," she whispered. "Marcus needs me. His appeal is coming up. I have to be strong for my boy." Her hand clutched at the hospital blanket, knuckles white with determination. Sarah felt something break inside her. 3 years of watching injustice from the sidelines, of pretending her father's actions didn't haunt these halls, came crashing down. "Mrs. Johnson," she said, her voice shaking, "I know about Marcus. I know what my father did, and I want to help make it right." The monitors beeped in the silence that followed. Linda studied Sarah's face, searching for any trace of her father's coldness. Finding none, she reached out and took the young doctor's hand. "Why?" she asked simply. "Because healing isn't just about medicine," Sarah replied, squeezing Linda's hand. "Sometimes it's about justice too." Judge William Harrison's study had always been a forbidden sanctuary. Dark wood panels lined the walls, law books gathered dust on heavy shelves, and decades of legal decisions were filed in cabinets that smelled of old paper. Sarah stood in the doorway, clutching a thick folder of evidence, watching her father read behind his massive oak desk. "Daddy," she said, using the childhood name she hadn't spoken in years, "we need to talk about Marcus Johnson." The judge's pen stopped moving. He looked up slowly, his reading glasses perched on his nose. "That case is closed, Sarah. You're a doctor, not a lawyer. Stay in your lane." Sarah stepped forward, dropping the folder on his desk. Papers spilled out. Court transcripts, witness statements, security footage timestamps, and a detailed analysis of his sentencing history. 3 years, she said, her voice trembling. 3 years of that boy's life gone because you couldn't see past the color of his skin. Judge Harrison's face hardened. "You don't understand how the law works." Evidence was presented. A decision was made. He tried to gather the papers, but Sarah placed her hand firmly on them. "I understand perfectly," she countered. "I understand that Linda Johnson nearly died in my ER last week because of the stress you put her through. I understand that you sentenced Marcus to 5 years while giving white defendants probation for worse crimes. And I understand that you've been doing this for years." The judge stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. "What happens in my courtroom is public record," Sarah interrupted. "The Innocence Project has been building a case. They've documented every biased sentence, every ignored piece of evidence, every rushed verdict. But I have something they don't." She pulled out her phone, playing a recording from a country club dinner where her father had bragged about being tough on certain elements. The color drained from Judge Harrison's face. "You recorded me? Your own father?" "A father is supposed to teach right from wrong." Sarah's voice cracked. "Instead, you taught me that power means never having to face consequences. Well, here are your consequences, Daddy." She laid out 3 choices. Help overturn Marcus's conviction, resign from the bench, or watch as she testified about everything she knew. "Your reputation, your legacy, your precious position in this town. It all ends unless you do the right thing." The judge sank back into his chair, suddenly looking old and tired. "You destroy your own family. You destroyed families every time you let your prejudice decide a case," Sarah replied. "Marcus was going to be a lawyer. Did you know that? He wanted to help people, just like I want to help people. The difference is, I won't ignore injustice to do it." Hours passed in that study. They argued, pleaded, and finally talked. Really talked, for the first time in years. Sarah showed him statistics, case files, and evidence that had been overlooked. She made him read Marcus's college application essays, showed him Linda's hospital records, and forced him to face the human cost of his actions. As dawn broke over Milton Creek, Judge William Harrison picked up his phone. With hands that shook slightly, he dialed his clerk's number. "Schedule an emergency hearing," he said, looking at his daughter. "We have a wrongful conviction to overturn." The courtroom was packed tighter than it had been 3 years ago. Local news cameras rolled as Judge Harrison took his seat, his face etched with lines of sleepless nights. Marcus Johnson sat beside his Innocence Project lawyers, wearing a suit his mother had bought him for this day. Linda Johnson held her breath in the front row, Sarah Harrison quietly sitting beside her. "The court is prepared to hear new evidence in the case of Marcus Johnson," Judge Harrison announced, his voice carrying none of its usual authority. For the next 2 hours, the truth unfolded. Security footage finally played in full. Witness testimonies were properly examined. Most shocking was the revelation that the real robber had been caught 6 months ago in another state, confessing to a string of similar crimes. Judge Harrison cleared his throat, looking directly at Marcus for the first time. "In light of this evidence, and," he paused, glancing at his daughter, "my own recognition of prejudicial conduct, I hereby vacate the conviction of Marcus Johnson and order his immediate release." The gavel's bang was drowned out by cheers. Linda rushed forward, enveloping her son in a tight embrace. Coach Thompson, now retired but still fighting fit, lifted Marcus off his feet in a bear hug. Tears flowed freely, not just from Marcus's supporters, but from many who'd witnessed justice finally being served. But Marcus's story didn't end with his release. Standing on the courthouse steps, surrounded by reporters, he made an announcement that surprised everyone. "Today, I'm establishing the Second Chance Foundation," he declared. "We'll help wrongfully convicted youth rebuild their lives and prevent others from facing what I did." Sarah stepped forward, her father watching from his office window above. "I'm joining the foundation's board," she announced. "As both a doctor and someone who's seen the system's flaws firsthand, I believe healing requires more than just medical care." The foundation grew faster than anyone expected. Marcus used his experience and education from prison to create programs for legal education, mentorship, and rehabilitation. Sarah brought medical resources and connections from the hospital. Even Judge Harrison contributed, though anonymously at first, providing insider knowledge of the legal system's weaknesses. 1 year after his release, Marcus stood at a podium in front of hundreds of law students. "Justice isn't just about laws," he told them. "It's about seeing people as people. My story could have ended in bitterness, but instead, it taught me that change is possible when we confront our biases and choose to do better." Linda, watching from the audience, wiped away tears of pride. Beside her sat Sarah, who'd become like a daughter to her, and even Judge Harrison, now retired and dedicated to prison reform. The local paper's headline that morning had read, "From wrongful conviction to right action. How one case changed a town's heart." Marcus ended his speech by holding up his newly earned paralegal certificate. "This is just the beginning," he said, smiling at the standing ovation. "Sometimes justice takes a detour, but with persistence, truth, and a little help from unexpected allies, it finds its way home."